So if you came 2 years ago, I gave a very similar talk. I tweaked it up a little bit. I added a little bit more information about the FDA. But did anyone ever heard of Motley Crue? All right, come on, Philip. All right, you got your hand up there. All right. I grew up I'm an 80s teenager. I grew up in LA, and they were like a big 80s hair band in LA. And I always liked Dr. Feelgood. And it was really cool to be able to tie that into this talk. And I also like this movie called Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. So I kind of fused these two together. But what my objective today is to show you what the benefits are that we actually get from government. It's not a government talk, but I want to convince you that there are pieces of our government that do look out for us, that are after our well-being. And I'm going to show you this in the context of a particular compound that I had the privilege of working on when I did research before I came to Western. So I've divided this up into two portions. The first portion, we're going to talk about what the FDA is, milestones about it, and then how do you get a drug to market? How do drugs come on sale? And I don't mean like on the corner, okay? Then we're going to talk about a particular drug called calicheamycin, and I'll talk about kind of how that sort of worked its way through the FDA process. And well, let's go ahead and get started. FDA, Food and Drug Administration, it's been around for quite a long time, but in different sort of, it wasn't always as we know it today. There's the headquarters in Maryland. At one point back in the 19th century, there were a lot of snake oil salesmen. And these were people that would go out and they'd sell swamp water or whatever and say, hey, this will cure baldness, or it'll make you taller, or it'll get rid of your rheumatism, or it'll do some miracle cure. And so people were selling all kinds of these little phony drugs, and maybe instead of growing more hair, it knocked the rest of your hair out, or did something that really wasn't too good. And so the government stepped in and said, we've got to have a way of controlling what things are being sold as, so that when someone says this is going to be useful for that treatment, it actually does what it's supposed to do. And as a consumer, how many of you have ever had to take some kind of we'll call them pharmaceutical agents, right? So the drug, the D word, right? How many of you have ever had to take aspirin or Tylenol or some drug at some point? Whoa, this is a healthy crowd. No one's ever had to take a drug in here. Well, that's great. I wish I had your genes. So at some point you had to take something, and did you ever question, is this really Tylenol? Or is this really Advil? Is this really going to take away my headache? Or did you just pop it open and take the pill? Right, because you have some faith that what is in that bottle is what it is. And that's the FDA's job, to make sure that the material's clean, that it's pure, it's going to do what it did. But way back when, that really wasn't happening very well. So the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office had an office open up where they had to analyze, they had to check agricultural products to make sure, like what the snake oil salesmen were selling, to make sure it did what it was supposed to do. So then over time, during President Lincoln's term in office, all the way down to President Kennedy, things evolved to where we have the FDA now. So we have certain laws in place. Congress has given FDA authority over food and cosmetic, medical appliances, pharmaceutical agents or drugs. And all of these things the FDA has power over to regulate, to make sure that they're going to work, they're going to be pure, that you're not going to get sick by using them within a reasonable amount of possibility, and that you have some Bill of Rights. So one of the things that President Kennedy did was he established a consumer Bill of Rights. And then we also want to make sure that these drugs are going to work. You're not just taking something that is not really going to do anything, that's just going to make you feel like you're okay, but actually does make you feel good. So FDA's been around a long time, it's evolved, and then now we have it kind of the way I'm going to describe it today. And one of the things that we might focus on the FDA doing is just banning substances, saying, no, you can't have this, we won't sell that, it's not good for you. Okay? Well, you've probably seen, if you've stayed home at one point during the day and you turned on channel whatever, broadcast TV, you probably saw commercials for a legal office, some attorneys. Have you taken this drug? Do you barf purple now? Does no friends want to hang out with you? Well, call us and we'll get you money. So it turns out that even though certain drugs will get approved by the FDA, that doesn't mean that down the road side effects don't crop up. And so one of the things the FDA will do is to regulate things. If something turns out is working just fine, but it causes a side effect that's really, really deleterious, it's really awful, they'll step in and say, nope, we can't do that. So there's a lot of examples up here, some things that are diet-based drugs, some things that you might take. Maybe, Zelnorm was a big example back 10 years ago, but it turns out these things actually have other side effects, like they might affect your heart, your respiratory system, other parts of your body. And so the FDA is always continually looking at data to make sure, are these drugs continuing to be safe? Okay. Now, besides looking at these types of things, the FDA is actually very proactive at making sure that what we have available is going to keep working for us. So, for example, way back when, in the dark ages, we had a nuclear reactor in Pennsylvania that almost melted down. It was called 3 Mile Island. It was like the worst nuclear disaster that our country's had. And radioactive material got out, and the FDA stepped up, and they passed out iodide tablets, which is a remedy that you can take to kind of help flush your system out with certain radioactive isotopes that would be given off by, this particular nuclear reactor. In fact, I think I just read the other day they're actually finally shutting down 3 Mile Island. Another thing FDA did was back in the 80s, there was a scare where people were taking Tylenol, and it was in the Chicago area. They were taking Tylenol, and they actually were dying because they found out that someone had been going in the stores, they think, and lacing the tablets with cyanide. And when you go buy drugs now, like you just off the counter, right? How is that material packaged? How are those pills or liquid packaged? Oh, that's right. You guys are all healthy. You don't take anything. What do you have to do?
They're in a box in a bottle that has a safety lid that's sealed and has cotton on it.
Right. And then you got to crank down on the top, right? So there's a seal you got to break and maybe a couple seals you have to break. Back then, there weren't any seals. You just popped the top off and there was the cotton ball and that was it. So now, because of that scare that we had, that people legitimately died, we have safety packaging, and that came out from the FDA. If you go on clinicaltrials.gov, the FDA literally has every single drug listed potentially that could go on the market that they're looking for people to try these drugs out. So let's say you've got, a grandma, and your grandma develops some kind of really horrendous tumor or develops some cancer that's pretty much inoperable, it's terminal. Well, someone may be working on a drug or a treatment that would deal with that kind of a problem, deal with that kind of an ailment. And so you can be an informed consumer and see what trials are there and in what trials you could be involved in as a trial subject. Okay, so all these things are being made available by the FDA. And most recently, FDA right now is looking at all the regulations or putting regulations in place for selling e-cigs or vape instruments. Because what have we seen lately in the news? What's kind of been a big thing with some vaping? Right, some people are just dying from it, and people your age are coming out with the lungs of 80, 90-year-old people because of vaping. And so they're looking at what kind of restrictions or regulations should be in place to make sure that if people are using that product, it's going to be used in a very specific way to minimize any kind of death or injury. Okay, now I want to point at one example that you can really say, man, this is one time our government really got it right. Our government really stood up for the rest of us. And this was this drug called thalidomide. By raise of hands, how many of you have ever heard of this compound or this drug? Okay, that's probably not surprising because this was really big decades ago. So thalidomide was a drug that was discovered in Europe. So someone had to make it in a lab. So they took smaller molecules and made a bigger molecule. And then this drug company tested it. And initially they found that, hey, this seems to be a pretty good medicine that you could take if you've got insomnia, or maybe it might relieve some symptoms if you have a cold. But then they found out and they claimed that, hey, you could take this stuff and not barf if you feel nauseous. And what kinds of people feel nauseous in the morning? Usually they're the female kind. Yeah, if you're pregnant, right? Morning sickness. You just feel cruddy, right? And there you go. So what if there was a drug available that you could take and not have those side effects of pregnancy? Wouldn't that sound like something, you might want to have? If I don't have to deal with barfing every morning, heck yeah, I want to take that. So in Europe, this was put out on the market, but Europe's not a very big market like compared to the U.S. There's 350 million people today in the U.S. Back in the 60s, yeah, a lot less, but still a lot more people than Europe. So the European drug company came to the U.S. and said, hey, we want you guys to test this for us over here and get FDA approval. So just because it's approved in Europe doesn't mean it could be sold in the U.S., or things approved in Canada can't necessarily be sold in the U.S. The FDA has to approve the drug, no matter where it comes from. And so a clinical trial was done by this drug company, this American drug company, and they said, well, wait a minute. This stuff doesn't work at all. It doesn't even knock rats out. So they even overdosed rats to try to see if they would knock them out, because it's this anti-insomnia medication. Wouldn't do anything. So they started to think, well, if this doesn't do what they're claiming, I don't really know if this drug is even good for anyone to take. So just imagine if you're pregnant, do you really want to take a lot of stuff that could potentially harm your baby? Right? I mean, we know smoking's not good if you're pregnant. Drinking's probably not good if you're pregnant. So would taking drugs be good? Would it be bad? Could be either way depending on the drug. So the FDA came out and said, look, we just don't have enough information. Nothing really is showing up that's saying this drug does what it's supposed to do. You're not showing us that it works, so why take that risk of having women take this drug if you can't even show it works? So why have them take this risk if you can't give us the concrete data? So this doctor at the FDA, Frances Kelsey, she came out and she actually fought and said, no, we're not going to have this put out. And you can imagine all the money that comes in for drug companies wanting to get this on the market, and you've got one lone person really standing up and saying, we can't allow this, we just don't know enough information. So does anyone know what happened with thalidomide at the end? What it actually did to the pregnant women? Yeah, Eric?
Birth defects.
So all their babies had birth defects. And they were really, really horrific birth defects. And those were the children that lived. There was a very high mortality rate, about 50% survival. So in Europe, there were over 10,000 cases of children born with these birth defects. So you could see that their arms, their limbs are malformed, right? And some of them, they didn't even form their limbs. And in the U.S., because this was in place, very few documented cases were known where babies were born with these birth defects. And that was only because we think maybe some people went to another country and got the drug where it was allowed there. So there's a lot of this whole generation in Europe, especially in Britain, where there are children or now adults that have survived this but don't have use of their limbs or limited use because these safety precautions weren't in place. And we had these safety precautions in place. So a lot of us, my age, we were not born with those issues. So I think this is a really good example of how the government can really benefit each one of us as consumers. Okay, now, how do you get a drug to market? It's not easy. You just saw the whole case with thalidomide. They went through this drug company, this whole process, and there were still issues, all right? So if you've ever watched or done anything with Greek mythology, you might have heard of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was this guy, and he had to roll this rock up a hill for all eternity because he was punished by the gods for what? I can't remember. It was probably something really dumb. And when he would get the rock to the top, it would roll right back down to the bottom, and he had to keep pushing it up the hill. So anytime someone says you have this I think it's Sisyphean task to do. It pretty much means you're not going to be able to get it done, okay? So sometimes as chemists, we might feel like this, because essentially this is what happens. This is what a drug company will do to get something to market, okay? So there's some kind of a discovery event, and there's some class of molecules that are very similar in structure, but they're modified just slightly differently from each other. And you might have thousands or hundreds of these in a whole group, and you screen them. Okay, so let's talk about hair loss. I'm here, let's talk about that. So we're going to see, does this cure hair loss? Does it make your hair grow back? So they're going to test this on a lot of these drugs on different assays. Will it work? And if it seems like it's going to work, then they go to the next stage. And they eliminate some of these compounds that don't work very well or don't work at all. Then they get to a stage where before it gets to you, or me actually, me and Philip up there. Sorry, Philip, calling you out there.
It's not all gone yet.
Yeah. I'm in the same boat. But before it gets to testing on people, or it's got to go through some kind of development phase, and things get winnowed down even more. So we started with this big pool, and we're winnowing down to smaller and smaller pools of molecules. And then we finally get to trials where they get to people like me or Philip, and then they're looking at, does this work? Is it going to cure baldness? And they go through all these different trials, and these trials can take years, and they have data, doctors and the chemists and the biochemists, they have to sit through all this data. And then finally you get to the point where maybe you have one or two that seem to work pretty well. Usually it's just down to one. Then you apply to the FDA, and then maybe after all that time, maybe 15 years or so, maybe 2 decades, maybe then you get the drug to market. And if you're lucky, you'll make some money off of that drug. So all that work will be worth it. Because if you think about all this time you're putting money into developing the drug, you've gotten no money back to recoup those costs. So you're spending lots and lots of money, I'm talking hundreds of millions of dollars, to get the drug tested to this point. And maybe you're lucky enough that you can get it to market and it's under patent, which means no one else can sell that same drug, that same molecule. So you have a window where you can make money off of that until the patent life ends, and then anyone can come in and make a generic drug and sell that for a lot cheaper. So sometimes this is how we feel, medicinal chemists that work on pharmaceutical agents. We feel like that guy pushing the rock up the hill, and then, oh, it's going great, and then, oh no, it killed the animals that we were testing on. Okay, got to start over. And then you're pushing it up the hill, and oh my gosh, it turned our hair green or made the rest of the hair fall out. Okay, rock goes back down to the bottom. So you have these issues that you have to overcome, just like Sisyphus did. But what I want to talk about just really briefly is this part here. Like, what happens when you get to the FDA? Okay, so you discover the drugs or drug, and you test it in vitro, which means in a petri dish, okay, on cells. You're not testing it in animals yet. Then you have to go to animal testing. And why do you think we have to test it in animals? Well, before we test it in people, we need to make sure, is this stuff toxic or is it pretty safe? Because just because it might cure cancer doesn't mean that it won't kill the other cells. You want to kill the disease cells, but keep the healthy cells alive. And so we use animal testing for that. And there's a lot of animals we have to test for different organs like brain and heart and liver and kidneys and things like that. You apply for a new drug application with the FDA. Then you have to go through 3 different rounds of clinical trials. Okay? So the first one deals with safety. So now that we've seen that these drugs seem to work okay with animals, we have to try it out in people. And we try it out in very small numbers, okay? How safe is this going to be? And then we also need to know, well, how does it get metabolized in your body? Okay? Does it go to your heart and work and then go to your liver and get metabolized? And what I mean by that is the molecule at some point kind of has to break down and then you excrete it out. So how do you excrete it? Do you sweat it out? Does it come out in your urine and your feces? What mode does this happen? So we have to know how the drug will move it throughout your body. And then the second trial is how well does it work? I could give you a drug and I could give you a placebo, which means it's just basically sugar, and you might be just fine and you might just be fine, which means, well, maybe it's not the drug. Maybe there's something else going on. So we have to see if the drug actually works in people. And then we also want to compare to other drugs. Because if there's a hair treatment that's a lot better on the market, well, why would I want to use the new one? I'll just use the other one. So we have to find, does this work as well or better than what's available on the market? And then the phase 3 trials, we'd be looking at a whole group of people. Because we might just look at one narrow group, like just this row of people right here, okay? And in that group, we might have a few males and a few females. And we might have a few that are of one ethnic background or another ethnic background. But it turns out that your gender, your ethnic background, maybe even your race, the gene makeup you have might actually affect how your body interacts with that drug. So we want to look at the whole big population because we have a diverse population in our country. How will this affect the whole group of people as a whole? So we have to look at large and larger samples of people just so we have enough data to say, you know, on a whole, it looks like this drug's going to work and the toxicity level's low through what we see this whole group of people. So we have to look at very broad populations. So once we get through that, then the new drug application gets reviewed. And this is really where you take all your data. This is like your classroom project for the whole semester. But this has been going on for years. And you turn it all into your teacher, and then they evaluate all your work. So that's kind of like what the FDA is doing here. You've collected all this data, and now you're handing it over, and they're going to check to see, did you do enough strenuous studies? Does it look like you looked for all the possibilities that could reasonably exist? Is this going to work? Is it going to cause a side effect? Okay, so a lot of things that are going to be looked at, and that might take a few years. And while this is going on, the facility where the drugs are made, hopefully it's not the trailer, you know, in the corner, but hopefully it's in a good manufacturing place where it's very clean and sanitary. They're going to make sure that you're following specific guidelines, certain standards. And then the FDA will say, boom, approved, go ahead and sell it. Or they'll say, well, hold on just a minute. There's a few things that you need to fix. Or there's some data that's kind of deficient. So the FDA goes through this whole process. And sometimes you really are not sure how this is going to come out until the very end. Okay? So there's 4 ways that you can accelerate things. I'm going to have to accelerate through this to get through everything that I need. So if you have a drug that falls into one of these 4 categories, you can get things fast-tracked where the FDA will essentially kind of let you cut in line for the paperwork and to try to get things to market because they recognize that sometimes there may be a health epidemic. Right now, what's kind of a big health epidemic that we're dealing with in our country? It just sort of come up in the last 10 years. There was just a big, huge thing in the news about a company that was sued for opioids, right? A lot of people are having opioids, and what are they doing with the opioids? They're using them, they're abusing them. Some people are overdosing on them because they had a backache and they went to the doctor, and the doctor gave them a whole lot of drugs, and they just popped a lot of pills and became addicted. So what if you had a drug that came out and helped people deal with that addiction or help them to not be hooked on those drugs? Would you think that would be something you would want to make sure would get to market maybe quicker? If you have a big epidemic, sure. What if you had a big flu virus that came out and everyone was getting really, really sick with flu? You would want that flu vaccination to get to market as quickly as you can. So the FDA can accelerate things through different tracks and different priorities based off of kind of some things about that drug and the needs to have that drug on the market. Okay. All right, so and one of the latest ones right now is an antibacterial drug development task force. Did you know there's not been a new kind of antibiotic come out in several decades? We're using sort of technology. Just imagine your computer that's 1960s technology. That's kind of what we're doing with antibiotics right now. So we're using very, very old technology because there just isn't a new type of antibiotic class out there. And so if you can come up with one that works, that kind of overcomes bacterial resistance, like we need that. Like we really need that. And the FDA will help that company to get that to the market or to make sure that that will, you know, go through the process safely. So here's some interesting info. I looked this up. Here are my sources down here. The FDA does not actually test any of these compounds. They're a regulatory body. They aren't the ones that are going to go work in the lab and do it. So if you're a drug company, if you're Pfizer or Merck or just Joe's, Drug Shack, you have to do all the testing on your own. So you have to get the doctors and the nurses and all the clinicians and the hospitals that are going to cooperate. You have to get them all together to do all this work. So the FDA won't do this. You've got to organize it all. It takes about 10 months for the FDA to review a new drug application. So you submitted all the data. It takes them 10 months. Can you imagine how long it takes your professors to review your work? Okay, they've got 10 months to get all this done on average. All right? And there's about 12 steps going from the clinical study process, going through testing in animals and people, till you finally get to the FDA review. So there's a lot of little boxes you have to check off. Okay? Just this year, up till May, I kind of stopped counting. The FDA, they actually are active in making sure the things that we use are safe. So there's been 41 recalls since January to May about drugs or medical devices or what have you that became contaminated, okay? That something might have been wrong with it, that they had to step in and say, hey, we need to halt production on this until we get this fixed. So the FDA is always involved in these things. There's about a 43% variance in the costs associated with getting these drugs to market. So there's a huge variation. It's not like one size fits all, depending on the drug. There's a lot of money that has to be spent. Just last year.
Only 12:30. You have time to get to your 1 o'clock class. If you leave now, it doesn't count.
Okay, so just last year, the FDA approved only 59 what we call NMEs or new molecular entities. Only 59 of these that were approved to be used, pharmaceutically. Okay. So all the companies that exist and all the drugs, all those tens of thousands of candidates, there was only 59 that the FDA approved last year. Okay. Not a very big number. But what's pretty remarkable, and this segues into the next segment, is that, I kind of jumped ahead. It costs about $1.3 billion on average to get a drug to market in the U.S. So you kind of get the sense of why drug companies have all these commercials on TV. Okay, hopefully you're just pondering that in your head like, wow, that's a big number. Yeah, so there's a lot of cost involved. They're trying to recoup that cost, and that's why we see so much advertisements. But of all of these new molecular entities, 32%, so 1/3, have actually been approved for cancer treatment. Why? Because cancer really touches everybody. Someone probably knows someone who has been affected by cancer. They've passed away or they've had just really, really horrible health effects. So the second part of my talk, and I apologize, I think I'm a little behind, is dealing with colchicamycin, this drug here. So here's different examples of different compounds that have been approved by the FDA, and they all do different things in the body, but the bottom line is they can all be used clinically to treat cancer. And they all work in a different method, okay? So some of these affect the DNA specifically. Some of them affect how cells divide. There's all kinds of different ways that you can keep cancer cells from growing or to be able to kill them, all right? So colchicamycin is a drug I'm going to focus on. There's 3 really interesting parts of the molecule, and I know this is drawn if you're not a chemist, this might be kind of hard to interpret, but this is the molecular structure, and there's 3 really interesting parts that I'm going to focus on for the rest of my talk. Okay, so colchicamycin was discovered back in the 80s. There was I don't think he was a chemist, I think he was a molecular biologist or a microbiologist, and he was on vacation, and he was sort of a rock guy. He was like this rock hound, and he went out in Texas, and he found this exact pebble, this rock, and he said, hey, that's sort of interesting. I wonder if there's any bacteria growing in it. So he knows that bacteria can grow in soil, and sometimes they can grow in rocks. On vacation, he takes the rock, he sends it back to his lab, back east. He's out in Texas, and he gets back, and they start screening this, and it takes him 2 years to figure out that this stuff kills DNA. But it doesn't just kill DNA. You guys know that old app, Fruit Ninja?
Yes.
Okay, what's the whole object of Fruit Ninja? What does it do? Cut the fruit, right? Okay, this is the fruit ninja of DNA. It just goes in, it's like, wow, slice and dice and hacks it all up. What do you know about DNA? Can a cell survive without DNA? No, because it's the genetic code that the cell needs to sort of be programmed to do what it does. No DNA, cell dies, there you go. And if we're talking about a cancer cell, even better. Cancer cells dies, there we go. So calicheamycin is really, really good at doing that. It just wipes out DNA. But it took 2 years to screen this, and it took several more years to tell us something more about the drug. But what we know, and I actually have a model of the calicheamycin, so I'm going to pass this around if you just want to take a look at it. This is kind of what it looks three-dimensionally. And this is the part that we lovingly call the warhead, because it actually acts like a warhead. So if you just don't mind passing it around. So what happens with calicheamycin is something reactive. You've got all kinds of reactive things in your cells. It'll come in and it'll attack these three sulfur atoms. A bond breaks, and this sulfur atom reaches around, and it likes to attack a carbon right there. It just has the right geometry. And when it does that, it squeezes this part together. Who's got that model? Here, let me see that model real quick. So it squeezes this part together, and when it squeezes that together, it makes these electrons sort of rearrange. And when it does that, it makes something called a radical. And a radical is really not good. It's very reactive, and that radical will get into DNA and start chopping it to pieces, okay? And we know chemically that this happens. Someone 20 years earlier in the lab with this same structure that we see in this drug, nature made this. Someone in a lab made this, and this person had no idea this existed. They proved how this drug worked even before the drug was discovered, okay? And this is what it looks like. There's your DNA, that's the purple and the yellow, and there's the drug that in blue there, and the white part is the warhead, and that just sticks itself right into DNA, and then it's able to just cut DNA up, okay? So it's almost like it was just made to fit right in that group of DNA. It's just a perfect fit. So, interesting. Okay, well, kind of getting close to time, so let me just move ahead here. And it turns out calicheamycin is awesome. It kills breast cancer cells, prostate cancer cells. It kills skin cancer cells, pancreatic cancer cells, and it's really great at killing B-cell leukemia, so cancer of the blood. Guess what it's also really good at killing? It's really good at killing you, your healthy cells. So your skin cells, your blood cells. Oh, it's great. It just kills everything. Do you see the problem with that? Does that sound like something you want to take? No. Yeah, not something. That's like you do your homework and you delete your errors in your homework, but you delete all the rest of the homework. Like no one wants that, right? So is this going to work? Nah, not really, because it's going to kill everything. So what do? Are you like Sisyphus and you're rolling the rock up the hill and you just quit and when it rolled back down? No, you just start pushing the rock up the hill because we're masochists. No, because we're not quitters. So it turns out if you take this drug and you bind it to something called an antibody, and we all have antibodies, they're part of our immune system. And if you attach it to the antibody of B cells, it will go and attack diseased B cells, okay? And right now there's all kinds of FDA approved, this is called monoclonal antibodies. There's all kinds of drugs that use these monoclonal antibodies. So next time you see a drug commercial, don't just change the channel. Look at the end where it has the name, and it'll have the big, product name like Viagra or Lipitor. And underneath it'll have another name. That's the generic name. If it ends in MAB, it's an antibody. So it's based off of biology, human biology. So all of these are based off of antibodies. And so they are like little smart bombs. Isn't that cool? Like a little Fruit Ninja smart bomb. It'll go right to that fruit and chew it up. It'll go right to that cell and blast its DNA. Okay, so here's an antibody. Here's your drug, and then it's hooked together to that antibody. So calicheamycin actually went through this process where people took it, attached it to the antibody for B-cell leukemia, and they found they could deliver it right to B-cell leukemia. And here's what it looks like. So there's the warhead you're passing around, and there's a little linker, and there's the antibody, and it'll go right to that diseased cell and it'll do away with it, okay? All right? So back in 2000, FDA said, this drug looks good. You're overcoming the toxicity issues. We're going to approve it for use, but there's a few caveats here. You have to be someone with this specific type of leukemia, and you have to have tried another type of therapy, and it didn't work. The other therapy didn't work. And you have to be of a certain age. You have to be over 60. Why? Because they wanted to limit any possible toxic side effects. Because these are kind of people who have had this disease that are sort of the end of the line. Like, if this treatment doesn't work, that's pretty much it. There's nothing else I can do. So it turns out that it still didn't work too great. Because if you didn't take Mylotarg, so the drug on the antibody, they changed the name now to Mylotarg, the brand name. So if you didn't take Mylotarg, you had about a 1% mortality rate. But if you took it, you had a higher mortality rate. What's wrong with that? Right, yeah, right? So why take it if it's going to kill me at a better chance than if I don't take it? So the FDA came out and said, look, you need to pull this off the market. So even though this was approved, the FDA still monitors things and still says, hey, guys, data's looking bad. We got to pull this off the market. Now, there's a few reasons why they think this happens, but one of the things that they know is that this antibody, this is the name of the antibody that's on B cells. It's in healthy cells. So if it kills the healthy cells, you could cause other problems. So there was an issue there. All right, so it's been off the market. Now, where I step in the last few minutes here is I worked at University of Wisconsin, and I worked in the pharmacy school, and I worked a bit on colchicine. But one of the things I looked at was, how can we put sugar molecules on other molecules? So it turns out that when you put sugar molecules, I'm talking about sugar that you put on your Frosted Flakes this morning, okay? But if you put sugar on molecules, and not like how you would do with your Frosted Flakes, I'm not talking about putting a scoop over your pill in the morning, but if you can attach it onto that drug, you can change the properties of that drug. You can make it more soluble. You can make it so the cells want to uptake it better. You might turn the drug from one sort of, it kills one disease and it might kill a different disease. So you can modify how that drug works. And so what I studied was easy ways of putting sugar molecules on other molecules. And so this is a process I call neoglycosylation. Neo is new. Glycosylation means putting a sugar on. And I looked at this on colchicine. And back at the beginning, I talked about that this part of the molecule is interesting, and so was this. But this part's really interesting. So here's a sugar molecule, and here's another one. And in between, they're hooked together by an oxygen and a nitrogen. We don't ever see that in nature. That never happens. It's so super rare. Well, this structure looks just like the structures I had been working on in my research. And so I just said, hey, what if I just took this, threw a sugar on? Would I get it to attach? And I know we're running out of time, so I'll try to speed this up. It turns out that I was able to get this sugar on called ribose, and ribose you find in your DNA. And I was able to get it to put on. And as it turns out that the activity of those drugs with that sugar on isn't very affected at as much as you would think. So actually it turns out that putting that sugar on that drug makes it less toxic. And if you can put something else on that sugar, then put that on the drug, you might have a way of getting it right to the cell it needs to go, just like how the antibody did. So this could be another potential way of turning this little fruit ninja guy into another smart bomb, okay? So kind of where are we with this? Oh yeah, and here's the drug. So here's DNA here, the gray part. And there's colchicine, and you can see the sugar I put on is sticking straight out away from the DNA. So what this tells me is that putting that sugar on shouldn't interfere with the drug interacting with DNA. So it should still kill the DNA, all right? Okay, so where did we end up with this? Well, my old boss at Wisconsin, he moved to Kentucky. He does other studies. He has nothing he's going to be dealing with this. Currently, there's a lot of drugs that are coupled to antibodies on the market. Here's a couple of examples. It's a $3 billion market share. as of last year. So still a big market for these kinds of drugs, okay? The drug company that came out with Mylotarg, they actually put this through another set of phase trials, and they tweaked how this drug is administered, and they found out it actually works a lot better by the dosage, changing the dosage. So they resubmitted it for FDA a couple years ago. FDA came back and said, yeah, we're going to approve it this time. And since that time, this has been in use. And in fact, the FDA approved another drug that's based off of calicheamycin, but for a different kind of leukemia treatment. They approved another use for that. So again, sometimes in your job, you may feel like this guy. You're shoving the rock up the hill and you're struggling and having a hard time. In fact, it may be you today trying to stay awake during my talk, like, oh, keep those eyelids open. But you want to keep doing your career. You want to keep going. You learn from your mistakes. You just keep pushing. So this is not the FDA. So hopefully I've convinced you that the FDA is here for a purpose or a benefit. They help us out. This is not the FDA. And hopefully this is what we are at the end, where we come out and we've done all that work and we've kind of made a difference, okay? So I know some of you have to leave. So if you need to go ahead and leave quietly. But for those of you who have questions, I would really like for you to just come down and we have a few minutes to talk, okay? Thank you very much for your attendance. And if